Welcome to Still Growing in Grace, a program dedicated to inspiring joy, giving hope, and delighting in grace. I'm Mike Zenker, and I'll be sharing with you a message of hope that will expand your understanding of God's love and amazing grace. God already deeply loves you, totally accepts you, and really, really likes you. Growing in Grace Ministries Canada and Hope Fellowship, your community church, invite you to enjoy today's program as we dig deeper into what it means to be still growing in grace. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today to a live broadcast of Still Growing in Grace. I have a guest coming in. I pre-recorded it, but it's a great video. One of several that we're going to try and do over the next little while. Dealing with the topic of knowing God's will. What is it? And all the confusion around it. But there's multiple lenses out there. I grew up with one lens that said, everything is God's way and God's will. And I want to unpack that because I think where I found more beauty is in the mystery of it. What is it really? Is it so simple? Well, I think it's simple and mysterious. So let's listen into a good conversation with Bill Thrasher. I think you'll really, really enjoy this. Hello, welcome to Still Growing in Grace, a program that highlights that all of us are still growing. None of us have arrived, and there's so many topics to learn and grow in. Welcome, Bill Thrasher from Atlanta, just south of Atlanta, or are you right in Atlanta?
Actually, north of Atlanta.
North of Atlanta. Well, how far away from Bill Murray?
Bill Murray or Richard Murray?
Richard. Bill Murray. Yeah, he'd be laughing too hard. Sorry.
Yeah, he's about an hour north of where I'm at.
That's cool.
Yep.
Have you had a chance to meet him?
Actually, he's come to our house. He actually comes to our home church when we were in session. He's come there quite a few times, and we've had him host and been a participant in several of our conferences we've had here locally. So yeah, he and I are very close.
That's cool. I really like him. I'm looking forward to getting to know him.
He's an awesome guy. Very, very, very much a mentor to me in many ways.
What was that noise? Did you hear that?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I heard some. Okay, I'm going to shut down other things just so we don't have any interruptions here. I want to talk to you about a topic that's come up in one of our small groups here at Hope Fellowship. The idea of the will of God. Now, I've taught on it. I've looked at it, discussed it with people, but I'm hearing a lot of chatter from folks that are deconstructing, those that are growing in grace, those that don't care about grace. They just like their traditional faith journey, but it's still a big issue. Well, what is God's will? They say, well, God's will is whoever's going to win the election. It's God's will. Or God's will is something we have to tag on the end of every prayer just in case. And I'm thinking, we got to unpack this thing. Yeah. And maybe it's not what we thought it was. I don't know. What have you heard that causes your flag to go up with alarm? Go, hang on. What kind of comments are causing you to want to jump on the topic of God's will?
Yeah, I think you hit a couple of them really clearly, and how kind of many of us who especially come through the Western mindset of church have kind of been taught to evaluate and interpret God's will, right? That God's will is this sovereign hand of control over all things, right? And I've definitely had to challenge that over the last several years of my own kind of, I'm pivoting away from deconstruction and going toward disassembly as my personal word. Because I think deconstruction is a sledgehammer that leaves you such small pieces sometimes that it makes it hard to reassemble it back into something that can really still have purpose and structure. So for me, disassembly, I want the same building blocks, but they just need to be put into a different framework, right?
Someone I spoke to used the word, it's a renovation more than a destruction. They're mixing up deconstruction with destruction.
Exactly. And then deconstruction can be done in a I think a more clean way, if you want to call that. But I think that word's grown some pretty, I don't know. Well, that's a whole nother topic for another day.
Let's do it. Let's do that topic sometime soon, because that's another big one I want to dive into. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But
will of God. Here we go.
Through my disassembly process, I love to think about words, right? And if you went in and said, hey, it's Mike Zenker's will that we were just talking football before we went live.
Yeah.
That the Patriots do better next year than they're going to do this year with Cam Newton. What would be a synonym for will there? Are you
Desire.
capable? Yeah, exactly. You're not capable of controlling it, right?
Mhm.
Even if you own the team, you really don't have the capability of you have pieces of control, but you don't have the ability to control all the variables in that situation. And I think when we take desire and anytime we just substitute that simple synonym, all of a sudden things shift in terms of understanding God's will, that God's will isn't some heavy hand of coercive manipulation, but it is this kind of tug of trying to use compassion and trying to guide us into a place of alignment with where his desires are and move us into the same mindset as his desires. And then all of a sudden we start co-creating some blessing to this creation that we are both, entangled with, so to speak.
Yeah, I grew up praying that I have to pray for God's will, and I have to make sure I find it. If it's going to be, it's up to me. So that mindset was a pretty big one. And as long as I could find a Bible verse to back it up, it's God's will.
That's right. And even then, the problem is there's a contradictory kind of thing happening there. Like God's got all the stepping stones out. He's laid them out for you. But it's you that has to walk them appropriately. And if you slip, then that's on you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to get back on the path and continue to walk them. Or maybe if you're lucky, God will create a new path off that path. But then that path was always really God's will. You just didn't know it. And then all of a sudden you get this like, nothing seems to make sense anymore, right? And so I think when we start to understand that God isn't planning out the future, which is a really hard thing for, I think, Westerners try and take hold of, but that God is, in his infinite goodness, allowing all things to be both free in their chaotic kind of manifestation, and simultaneously we can trust his desires and his love to be strong enough to pull that towards some sort of outcome where everything ends up for good. It seems to be contradictory, but it's not. It's a paradox, and there's a big difference between paradox and contradiction. And so God's desire, his power of love, this unfailing love is guaranteed to take us somewhere, despite the freedom of our desires to cohabitate and co-create inside of this existence, right? And so that's some big stuff. I know it's big concepts, but it does start to shift this whole, thing, this control mechanism that we've been taught so many times and so for so long.
So I guess our concept of God plays a major role in how we view this topic of what is the will of God.
Exactly.
So what would be a harmful perspective that you've come across that is an unhealthy way to see God?
Yeah, I think when God, everything starts to reframe in our hearts when we take Christ and the person Jesus and start to understand him as the exact representation of God, as Hebrews tells us. I believe 10:3, I think. And before I had that in my kind of perspective, I was kind of always under the impression through the teachings I had been, raised with, that God wasn't necessarily son. In fact, God was kind of, Jesus was God, but he really wasn't. And God was kind of in one area at odds with Jesus, and another area in alignment with Jesus. And there's a Holy Spirit thing that's over there floating around that maybe comes when you call her, maybe does when you don't. That when I come to a perspective that God is this force that is both sovereign but also manipulatable and independent of Christ in some way, shape, or form, then there's a lot of unhealthiness that begins to come from that very quickly. And that's just not even in a Christian paradigm. I think almost every faith paradigm, has this kind of essence. And I think mimetic theory, not to take a tangent, says that. It says that human beings have all kind of missed our mark, sinned, on misunderstanding that God is this appeasable force through something we can
If
do.
we do it right.
Right. And God in that will is for us to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
But we always fail. So God's created some sort of, again, workaround that we can maybe get back into his good graces, get back in his goodwill, and then we throw Jesus into that equation and yada, yada, yada. When we take that off the table and we replace God's nature with Christ as the exact representation and begin to elevate Christ as the fullness of the Godhead in our understanding, our tangible understanding, and we understand that the Trinity itself in all ways looks like Christ, who laid down his life, who gave up his will, who gave up his control, and decided not to strong arm us into doing something one way only, and yet still in our alienated state, in our place of enmity, gave us grace and gave us love. Well, all of a sudden God changes, and now he's not forcing us into some sort of narrow path of will, but he's bringing forth a fruit, a garden of fruit where our wills begin to blossom with the same desires of his heart.
Well, that goes against what I kind of heard growing up, that if it's
Yeah.
going to be God's will, it's not going to be a good situation. So when we pray for God's direction for our future, please don't send me to Africa. But if you go, well, it has to be God's will, because you know what? We can't do things we enjoy. It's got to be a difficult thing. Or even worse, in relationships, I don't want to marry this person, but it's God's will. It's going to be a really rough one. Or I'm in a bad marriage. Oh, it's God's will. I stay with them. Are you kidding? To me, this is brutal when it comes to misconceptions of God's will and how it carries out in Christian tradition.
Absolutely.
Because let's look at some marriages for a moment. There are some marriages that are in a really bad place, but one of the spouses just feels they're, waiting for God's will, and it must be their role is to suffer for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to that? Because to me, there's something really wrong with that. To me, the grace is to move out for healing or permanent, whatever ends up becoming the outcome. I don't know, but the idea of living in abuse, that's not God.
No, it's not. And I think that's where, we replace that will, that path of force, that we've kind of framed that word around, and we replace it with the synonym desire. Is it God's the desire for us to live in any situation which brings suffering or harm into his kids? I mean, we can take an easy, parallel. Do you as a father, or me as a father? I'm a father of 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
Do I ever want my kids to suffer? Heck no.
No, you would jump in right away.
Absolutely. Am I also willing as a father, desiring as a father to slowly grant, which I have a 17-year-old and 15-year-old now, by the way, so I'm in that phase, grant them certain freedoms where they can taste the consequences of those freedoms naturally, inside of enough of a controlled way. Not that I'm trying to control them, but I'm trying to allow them to have some sense of, if I do this, there is an unhealthy result.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that there is that part of the equation, and that gets confused with will a lot of time. There's a lot of confusion that, because there are still negative consequences to many of our unhealthy decisions in this life, that we think that God is, punishing us for making a bad mistake. And he's not ever punishing us. Perfect love frees us from that fear of punishment, right? That's what it says in 1 John. But
back to our concept of who we think God is.
Exactly, back to there. So God is not punishing us, but God is allowing us to explore that co-creating power that we have. And there are consequences against unhealthy decisions, and he allows us to do that. Just like you may allow your toddler to wander around and fall down a few times before they figure things out. It's not an unloving freedom. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's an extremely loving freedom. And we are given the opportunity to go and find those fruits of the Spirit and find out, are they really what, brings life to this creation, to ourselves, to those around us. Joy, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness.
Hey, let me flip it one other way, because I can hear somebody's voice in my head right now. It's switching to a job perspective, because marriage, that's one extreme category. Okay, the way I was describing it, that is an extreme. But there are people that are in jobs and they have this idea that what's God's will for me, and they think that it means now I got to go find what I love to do the best, follow my heart's desires, when the job you have is completely supporting your family.
Exactly.
Your attitude that needs to change. Has that come up in your talk and your thinking?
Oh, absolutely. It's come up in my personal life. Oh yeah. I actually, I was on staff at a church for 2 years and left a very good job, and I had dreams. And honestly, to this day, I think it was a healthy decision in many ways, but it came with a lot of consequence. Am I going to call it God's will? Like, did God put that opportunity in one place, and then if I didn't hit that door, then the rest of my life was going to fall apart? No, I don't think that. I think it was one of many avenues of options that I had in front of me, and God was partnering with me in that journey. But I mean, it did come with positive impacts.
Yep.
And it also came with a lot of negative impacts, and both of those are just part of this experience that is life. And the more you realize, again, like you're saying, that God is not for and or against any given thing, but with us through the entirety
But that's
of
hard.
that experience.
That's hard to take in.
Even the worst of decisions, and that's really hard to take.
Well, then you're second guessing. Now you're wondering, I should have took door number 3. Why would I do? What was I doing there? Like, second guess is like
the work thing. I mean, let's say you embezzle millions of dollars, and that God partners with that, co-suffers with that. I mean, that just doesn't feel right. And yet, that's what Jesus tells us. I mean, Jesus shows us that in the flesh when he goes and eats with Zacchaeus, right? Like, he's God in the representation of Christ isn't afraid of getting dirty with us, and also then walking out of that mess with us and walking back to the Father's house where we're covered in pig crap. And
because I don't think it's God's desire. I don't think it's God's desire for us to stay in that embezzlement of whatever category you want. He'll enter into that with us. Yes. So he's not absent, and find a way out of it. And it might be jail. It might be hell. It may
not even be inside of this temporal world.
Yeah.
It may be beyond the veil of this paradigm that we experience right now. And that's, I think, the beauty of God's greatness, right? The quote unquote sovereignty part of God is there's not a place we can escape his love for us.
So when somebody asks you, what is God's will? Have you got a response? Or is that too much on the spot?
No, I do. I think God's, my personal answer for that in the elevator speech scenario is God's ultimate desire. God's ultimate will is 2 things: to know that you are unconditionally loved, number 1, first and foremost, and to allow that love to become who you were meant to be. An image bearer of the divine, right? You are a reflection of that unconditional love, that you begin to take that love and radiate it inside of this world. That's it. God's foremost will, as expressed on the cross, is to know that you are completely loved and express that love in return. Everything boils down to that, right? And then if you think about Jesus and the greatest commandment and those kind of things, a new commandment, that's what he was saying. He was basically saying, that's God's greatest desire is for you to know that you to love others as you've first been loved.
But if you grew up in the church, you've been conditioned to hear that God's will is a plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the very first evangelism tool used for many people is that God has a plan for you. Right?
No, the plans I have to you prosper. It's like Joshua, I think. Yeah, exactly. Right. Jeremiah. We go to an Old Covenant verse and we pull it way out of context, and boom, this is the will of God. Right. Yeah. That may have been the God. Yeah.
I've used the phrase that the will of God is a person. It is Jesus. Jesus is the will of God for us. But that leaves us stuck inside this huge building, okay, that's dark. and you're sitting in the dead center, and all you look up and see all this, or how about a huge field, looking at the stars, right? Like massive, like which one? There isn't one. This is enjoying the awe of God. And for the next 10 minutes, you're gonna look at that color scheme over there. And then for half an hour, you can look at a different one. Like it isn't a controlled thing. It's about the presence awareness, which will guide you into all thinking, including good choices, bad choices. Like I've prayed for God to give me a sense of a choice. What decision do I make? And I never heard. And so I had to choose, and he was still in it. But I didn't know that at the time. It was hindsight that allowed me to see how God has been present, even in my anxiety, which revealed where I was living from my dependence was on my decision making, which is extremely humbling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is where it gets, I think, it can get nuanced in each individual's experience with God. I experience the divine in a different way than you, than I do a different way from my wife. And I think as humans, we want to take how I've experienced it and maybe place it as this kind of boilerplate thing. And I have no doubt in my mind that there have been moments in time where I have felt explicitly guided into a situation, or there has been a coincidence. Great coincidence, right? There's two things happening, and there's just, we call it a God thing. It's just this this collision of grace and truth and love, and just how did this all happen? And so I don't want to deny that there is something much more entangled happening in this creation, that there is this force of love that is gravitating all things together for goodness. And that is part of God's will. And so I don't want to ever take that out, that there is and I'm probably using the wrong word, but it's the only word I have, I think, in human language, a destination that we're headed to, but it's not a place.
Right.
It's not a physical place. We would call it heaven, maybe again in our language, but it is a state of being.
It's not real estate.
Right. Yeah. It's not real. Yeah. It's a state where all creation is groaning for us to awaken to our identity, right? As sons, daughters of God. Right. And so there is a desire that the desire of God is entangled with every element of creation, inside of every breath of I am Bill, I am Mike, I am Steve or Craig or Julia or any whatever name. Every one of us has the voice, the breath of I am in us. And so when our identities capture the taste of God's desire in its truest and most pure sweetness, we can't help but to want more.
Well, there's a knowing. There's this, whatever it is.
It's so supernatural.
Can't make it up.
So supernatural that we're made to, we crave it, and we can't help but to allow our will to come into alignment with Father's will.
I wonder if the question sometimes is wrong. The idea of what is God's will. I don't hear Joseph asking that question. I didn't see Adam ask that question. Moses, Peter didn't really ask that question. Like it's an odd question. I think only church people ask that one. Huh.
I think so. And I actually pulled it up right before we started. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, which is kind of one of those, I think, we take one thing and especially in the Bible and like good grab it. And then this is the will of God, the sanctification of you. We're like, it's for you to be holy, right? And then we go to legalism and what does holy mean? And this is where all this stems from, is there's one or two of these writings that we just have totally taken out of context and misapplied.
But you didn't. You put it into context. You, at least the way you paraphrased it, was to know our identity.
Well, if you come from a perspective of identity, exactly. If you come from a perspective of holiness being the legality equation, right? Then we can twist it, which is what religion does time and time and time again. But once we break free of that bondage and we realize that we are unconditionally included and loved in God's good, great goodness, then now it does become it changes the entire, that God's greatest desire is for you to know you are completely set apart. And it goes on in that same verse.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, it goes on in the same verse to say you shouldn't, you need to abstain from sexual immorality. But that's not what the words mean, right? It's not what the words mean. It means don't sell yourself. That's all it means. Don't sell yourself. Sell yourself to what? It's not talking. I mean, I think we take it and we literalize things like that so poorly in our, again, the way we've been brought up. We take Paul's writing and we think he's talking about literal sex. And maybe there's a facet there, but there's something so much deeper going on. It's about the union that we were made for, not about the union we're selling ourselves into. That's a facsimile of what true union is meant to manifest and grow.
So you were saying something about discovering your what? You start with the C, complete holiness or whatever, but the word completeness snuck in there in my mind, that to discover that how complete we are.
That's right.
Otherwise we're craving for something that is already ours.
A sense of lack.
From somebody that we already are and don't know it.
Yeah. Yeah, we start with a position of lack or an identity of lack. Then we can never understand that there's never enough. I've seen that so many times. I know so many people that believe that God's will is for you to have more God. I just need more. I just need more. I just need more. And that goes back to your thing. God's greatest desire, as we've kind of already touched on multiple times, is for you to know that you are completely loved, right? And not completely as in only on God's equation, but that you are full. You are the fullness of that love right now as you are, no strings attached.
So that might mean it's not about trying to find God's will, but to find God in us in its fullness so that it will then overflow. It's like popping the cork. Once we discover, like we shook the bottle long enough that boom, it's going to explode and the carbonation is just going to keep spilling out because it can't.
So you're going to make me go PG-13 on this thing because what you're describing,
no.
You're describing is the intimacy of orge.
Yeah.
Right. Wrath. You're describing those things right here. We're taking a little tangent, but God's will is for us to experience his, and this sounds crazy, wrath. Not wrath as in the negative. Wrath is in the passion. The word means swollen with passion.
Yeah. Yikes.
Yeah.
So quickly moving on. But that word orge, the word wrath, if you look it up in the lexicons and dictionaries for all the church leaders that study, there's more than one word there listed as definitions. It's like you look up the word root in the dictionary. Well, do you mean R-O-O-T or R-O-U-T-E? Like, what do you mean? So the word orge there is referring to any intense emotion. Absolutely. Well, one of them's anger.
Yeah.
And then there's excessive love. So which one is it? Like, I have excessive anger or emotion or wrath when my kid's about to get hit by a car. I will lunge out to try and save it. Absolutely. And I scream and I look like to the outside. Pardon?
Not against us. It's only directed for us.
And against anything that harms us.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo. And when we understand, again, now we're redefining in our consciousness who God is. And that starts to then completely reframe his desires as we know them with intimacy, as we know them with union. And once we become one in our alignment of thinking with that, now we begin to manifest and co-create those same desires in our own lives effortlessly. And I don't want to do the things that's harmful to myself anymore, whatever that is. I don't want to make that bad decision. My son made a terrible decision last night. I'm not going to get into the details, but he's having to learn that I can respond with anger or I can respond with grace, right? And I had a little bit of both. Both of them were passionate for my son, not against him, because I don't want him to be harmed by the negative consequences of a 17-year-old boy, right? And so I think my heart for him is the same heart except even better for us from our representation that we see in Christ of the Father.
Yeah. That's really cool. I'm looking at the clock. We're done.
We are there.
28 minutes and 34 seconds.
There's a lot to unpack.
We got to come back to this one because I got a couple of notes about God's will that it'd be fun to chat with you about, and if we're prepared for it, it'll go deeper. But the idea of basics, we just talked about the basics today. Then the question of, does God control? It's going to come in. It's all part of this. What is God's will? We still didn't define it, although it's being defined. It may not have a perfect definition. And what about free will? How does that fit in? Right? Those are big ones.
They are big ones.
So if you're game, I mean, maybe we'll pull in Richard Murray into this too. It'd be
the three of us would have a great time. Like I said, and I love Richard, and we definitely would have some good conversations there for sure.
Good. All right. Well, thank you for taking time with me today. Folks, thanks for watching Still Growing in Grace. Enjoy us when we come back next time, as we can probably continue this topic, or we may popcorn and jump between a couple of topics moving closer to this next season. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Join me next time on Still Growing in Grace for more good news. Enjoy previous episodes by downloading our podcast at growingingrace.ca. You can also visit hopefellowshipycc.com to find our service times and location. If this show has been an encouragement to you, please consider making a donation today at growingingrace.ca and help us keep spreading this good news. Thank you again for tuning in to Still Growing in Grace.